Frank Sinatra was in the middle of filming the role that would save his career when a stunt extra hit the ground hard and didn't get back up. What Frank did in the next 60 seconds didn't just stop production on the movie he'd spent 2 years begging to get. It risked the only chance he had left in Hollywood. And Burt Lancaster, who watched it all happen, said Frank Sinatra just became the bravest man he'd ever known. It was August 1953, Halona Beach Cove in Hawaii. The temperature was pushing 95 degrees with humidity that made the air feel like soup. Frank Sinatra, Burt Lancaster, Montgomery Clift, and director Fred Zinnemann were deep into production on From Here to Eternity, a film that would change Frank's life forever. But on August 14th, something happened on that set that almost killed the entire production. Something that revealed who Frank Sinatra really was when everything was on the line. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand where Frank was in his life in 1953. He was 37 years old, and he was finished. 2 years earlier, he'd been on top of the world. The Voice, Bobby Soxers fainting at his concerts, records selling millions, movies with MGM, his own TV show. Then it all collapsed. His voice was shot, vocal hemorrhaging from stress, from pushing too hard, from the chaos of his life with Ava Gardner. He couldn't hit notes he'd been singing since he was 16. When he tried to record in 1952, his voice would crack, break, fail him completely. The instrument that had made him famous was betraying him. Columbia Records listened to the sessions and dropped him, just like that. "We can't sell records where you can't sing." CBS looked at his television ratings and canceled his show. "The numbers aren't there anymore, Frank." MGM looked at his box office returns and terminated his movie contract. "You're not a draw anymore." His records weren't selling. Radio stations stopped playing him. Clubs that used to beg for him now wouldn't return his calls. Ava Gardner, the woman he'd left his wife for, the woman he'd destroyed his first family for, had left him. She was in Spain filming with bullfighters, barely speaking to him. The love that had consumed him was turning to ash. His first wife, Nancy, had divorced him. His 3 children looked at him with confusion and hurt. He was a stranger in his own family. The press that once loved him now called him washed up. Sinatra's finished at 37. From Bobby Sox to box office poison. The voice is gone, and so is the career. Frank was broke, actually broke. He'd spent money like it would never end. Now it had ended, and he owed everyone. The IRS, his ex-wife, Ava, his lawyers. He was selling his possessions to pay bills. He was living in a small apartment, alone. No voice, no wife, no career, no money, no future. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, wondering if this was it. If he'd peaked at 30, and now it was just a long, slow slide into being forgotten. And then, in early 1953, he read From Here to Eternity, the novel by James Jones about soldiers in Hawaii before Pearl Harbor. And there was a character, Private Angelo Maggio, a scrappy Italian-American soldier who gets beaten to death for standing up to a sadistic sergeant. Frank knew that role was his. He could feel it. Maggio was him, the underdog, the fighter, the guy who wouldn't stay down. But Columbia Pictures didn't want Frank Sinatra. They wanted established actors. Frank was box office poison. A liability Frank begged, actually begged. He called everyone he knew. He offered to do it for scale. $8,000 when he used to make $150,000 per picture. He told Columbia he'd do it for free if they'd just give him a chance. Finally, after months of rejection, Columbia said yes, probably because Frank was the only name actor desperate enough to work for that little money. From Here to Eternity was Frank's last shot, his only shot. If this movie failed, he was done. Not just in movies, done completely. Back to singing in small clubs for people who remembered when he used to be somebody. That's the Frank Sinatra who showed up in Hawaii in July 1953. Desperate, terrified, and determined to prove he wasn't finished. The movie business in 1953 was brutal. Studios treated human beings like replaceable parts. Extras, stunt performers, crew, they were invisible, disposable. If you got hurt, that was your problem. The show kept rolling. Frank had seen it his whole career, but he'd never been in a position to do anything about it. He was too busy trying to survive himself. But something was different about this production. Maybe it was working with serious actors like Burt Lancaster and Montgomery Clift. Maybe it was the desperation of knowing this was his last chance. Or maybe Frank Sinatra had just reached a point where he couldn't stay silent anymore. Whatever it was, August 14th was the day Frank stopped being just another actor and became something else entirely. The scene they were shooting was the famous beach fight sequence. Maggio gets beaten by Sergeant Fatso Judson. Brutal, realistic, physical. They'd hired about 20 stunt performers and extras to fill out the scene. Soldiers watching, reacting, some of them getting into scuffles themselves. Most of them were local guys from Honolulu working for $50 a day. Good money in 1953 if you survived the day. One of those extras was a 29-year-old former Navy man named Burt Kahale. Bobby had been doing stunt work for about 3 years, picking up whatever jobs came to Hawaii. He had a wife, Leilani, and a baby daughter. He'd been thrilled to get hired on From Here to Eternity. Working with Burt Lancaster and Frank Sinatra, that was the kind of credit that could change a career. Bobby's job that day was simple. During the fight scene, he was supposed to get shoved, stumble backward, and fall onto the sand. Easy stuff for a guy who'd done actual Navy training. But what Bobby didn't know was that the sand where he was supposed to land had a rock hidden underneath. A volcanic rock, sharp and solid, buried just below the surface. The location scout had missed it. The assistant director called action. The fight erupted, bodies moved, and right on cue, a stuntman shoved Bobby backward. Bobby stumbled, fell exactly where he was supposed to fall, and the back of his head hit that rock with a sickening crack. He went down hard and didn't move. The assistant director yelled, "Cut!" For about 3 seconds, the entire beach was silent. Then everyone started moving at once. The stunt coordinator sprinted to Bobby. The on-set medic grabbed his bag. Crew members crowded around, and Frank Sinatra, still in his army uniform costume, pushed through the crowd. Bobby was conscious, but barely. Blood was pouring from the back of his head. He was trying to talk, but the words weren't coming out right. His eyes weren't focusing. The medic took one look and said the words everyone feared. "We need an ambulance, now. This is serious." The production manager appeared. A man named Gerald Foster, Columbia's guy, the one who made sure the film came in on budget and on schedule. He looked at Bobby on the ground, blood soaking into the sand, and said something that made Frank's blood run cold. "Get him off my beach, put him in someone's car, and take him to the hospital. And find out who did the location survey. They're fired." That was it. No concern for Bobby, just get him off my beach, like he was trash that needed cleaning up. The medic started to argue. He shouldn't be moved until Foster cut him off. "We're losing light. Every minute costs money. Get him out of here and reset the scene." Frank Sinatra was standing right there. He heard every word, and something inside him, something that had been compressed by 2 years of begging and desperation and humiliation, finally snapped. He walked over to Foster. His face was calm, his voice low. "What hospital?" Foster barely looked at him. "Queen's Hospital, I guess." "Why? Who's paying for it?" Foster finally looked at Frank. "That's not our problem. He signed a waiver. These guys know the risks." Frank took a breath. "So Columbia's not covering his medical bills?" "The studio provides on-set medical care. Anything beyond that is his responsibility. That's standard." "Standard! Yes, now if you don't mind, we need to reset the scene without me." The entire beach went quiet. Foster's face went red. "Excuse me? You heard me. I'm not shooting another frame until that man's medical bills are covered." Crew members stopped moving. Burt Lancaster, who'd been in his trailer, emerged and stood watching. Fred Zinnemann, the director, put down his script. Foster tried to laugh it off. "Frank, come on, don't be dramatic. The guy signed a waiver. This is how it works." "Not anymore, it doesn't." Foster's smile disappeared. "You have a contract." Frank took off his costume helmet and handed it to a nearby crew member. "Watch me break it." Foster stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You walk off this set, your career is over. You understand? Columbia will bury you. You'll never work again. And you need this movie, Sinatra. Everyone knows it. You're broke. You're desperate. You walk away from this, you've got nothing." And there it was. The truth, laid out like a weapon. Frank knew it. Everyone on that beach knew it. This was his last chance. Walk away, and he was finished forever. The silence was absolute. Frank looked at Foster, then at Bobby, still bleeding on the sand, then back at Foster. "Then I guess I've got nothing. But that man isn't going bankrupt because your location scout missed a rock." Foster played his trump card. "You're holding up a production that employs 200 people. Every day we don't shoot, that's 200 people not getting paid. You want that on your conscience?" Frank looked around at the crew, electricians, camera operators, makeup artists, all watching. "How many of you have been hurt on a set and had to pay your own medical bills?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, hands started going up. 1, 3, a dozen. More than half the crew. Broken bones, concussions, burns, falls. All of them had paid out of pocket because the studio said it wasn't their problem. Frank turned back to Foster. "So it's not just Bobby. It's all of them. Every person here who's been chewed up and thrown away." Foster's jaw tightened. "This is a business, not a charity. Then let me make this simple. Either Either Columbia Pictures pays every penny of Bobby Kahale's medical bills, surgery, rehab, everything, or I walk, and I take this story with me. I'll tell every reporter in Los Angeles exactly why From Here to Eternity shut down. How a man got his skull cracked because your location scout didn't do his job and the studio refused to help him. The threat hung in the air. Foster's face went from red to purple. You don't have that kind of power. You're finished, Sinatra. Nobody cares what you say. That's when Burt Lancaster stepped forward, the biggest star in Hollywood, the name above the title. He walked right up to Foster and stood next to Frank. Didn't say a word, just stood there. Then Montgomery Clift joined them, then Fred Zinnemann, then the cinematographer. One by one, key members of the production walked over and stood with Frank Sinatra, a silent wall of solidarity. Foster looked around at the faces staring back at him. He was outnumbered. If Frank walked, the movie was dead. If Burt Lancaster walked with him, Columbia would lose everything. Foster pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his face. I need to make a call. He disappeared toward the production office trailer. Frank didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed, waiting. The crew didn't reset the scene. Nobody moved. The entire production was frozen, thousands of dollars burning away every minute, but nobody cared. Something bigger than money was happening. 20 minutes later, Foster emerged. His face was carefully neutral. Columbia Pictures will cover Mr. Kahale's medical expenses, all of them. Frank didn't smile. I want that in writing. Today. You'll have it by end of business. And I want to know Bobby's condition before we shoot another frame. Foster hesitated, then nodded. Fine. Frank turned to the crew. Anybody here want to keep working under these conditions? Speak up now. Nobody spoke. The answer was written on every face. Zinnemann cleared his throat. Let's take the rest of the day. We'll resume tomorrow. As the crew dispersed, Burt Lancaster pulled Frank aside. That was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen. You know you just made yourself a target, right? And you risked your whole comeback. Frank looked out at the ocean. I spent 2 years begging for this role, humiliating myself, offering to work for nothing. I needed this movie more than I've ever needed anything. Then why risk it? Because what's the point of getting my career back if I become someone I can't look at in the mirror? I've lost everything, Burt. My voice, my wife, my money, my reputation, but I haven't lost who I am. Not yet. Lancaster studied him, then extended his hand. You're going to win an Oscar for this movie, Frank. I can feel it. Frank shook his hand. If we finish it. That night, Frank went to Queens Hospital. Bobby was in surgery. His wife, Leilani, was in the waiting room, holding their baby, staring at a hospital bill estimate that would destroy their family. Frank sat down next to her. Mrs. Kahale, I'm Frank Sinatra. I was there when your husband got hurt. Leilani looked up, her eyes red. Is he going to be okay? The doctors are doing everything they can, but I need you to know something. Columbia Pictures is paying for everything, every penny, surgery, rehab, lost wages, everything. You don't have to worry about the money. Leilani stared at him. What? How? Because what happened to your husband wasn't his fault, and it's not right that you should suffer for it. She broke down crying, not from fear, from relief. Frank stayed until Bobby came out of surgery. 3 hours in an uncomfortable chair, drinking bad coffee, just being there. Bobby Kahale survived. The surgery repaired most of the damage. He had headaches for years after, and his balance was never quite the same. He never did stunt work again, but Columbia paid his medical bills, all $12,000 of them, and 6 months later they hired him as a location scout, the job he'd needed them to do right in the first place. From Here to Eternity resumed production the next day. Frank was quieter than usual, but he was there, and the crew, they would have walked through fire for him after that. The studio tried to retaliate. Word spread in Hollywood that Frank Sinatra was difficult. His next 3 film offers were withdrawn, but Frank had something they hadn't counted on. He had Burt Lancaster telling everyone what really happened. He had Fred Zinnemann backing him up, and he had a crew spreading the word. Within months, the story became legend. Not in the press, the studios made sure of that, but among the people who actually made movies. Frank Sinatra became more than a star. He became someone who stood up. In 1954, the Screen Actors Guild pushed through new insurance requirements for productions. Studios had to carry comprehensive coverage for all performers, including extras and stunt workers. The change was directly influenced by what happened on From Here to Eternity. Frank never took credit, but everyone knew. Bobby Kahale kept in touch with Frank for the rest of Frank's life. Every year, a Christmas card. Every year, Frank would call. When Frank Sinatra died in 1998, Bobby Kahale was at the funeral. He was 74, walking slowly, his balance still off from that day in the Hawaiian sun. A reporter asked him what Frank Sinatra meant to him. Bobby said, Frank Sinatra saved my life that day, not just my body. body my whole life. He taught me that you don't have to be powerless, that standing up for what's right matters more than keeping your job, even when keeping your job means everything. But he was a big star, the reporter said. Bobby shook his head. No, he wasn't. Not then. He was desperate, broke. That was his last chance. Walking away could have ended him forever, and he did it anyway. For me, a guy he didn't know. That's not a star move. That's a good man move. March 25th, 1954. The RKO Pantages Theater in Hollywood. The 26th Academy Awards. Frank Sinatra sat in his seat wearing a tuxedo he'd borrowed because he couldn't afford to buy one. Nancy was with him, his ex-wife, the mother of his children, the woman who'd supported him through the collapse. Ava was in Spain. She hadn't come. When they called his name for Best Supporting Actor, Frank didn't move for a second. He couldn't believe it. After everything, after the humiliation, the desperation, the collapse, he'd won. He walked to the stage. Greer Garson handed him the Oscar. It was heavier than he expected. Frank looked out at the audience, at the studio executives who'd written him off, at the actors who'd whispered he was finished, at the industry that had buried him. And he didn't thank the studio, didn't thank Columbia Pictures. He thanked Fred Zinnemann for believing in him. He thanked Burt Lancaster for standing with him. He thanked Montgomery Clift for showing him what real acting was. And then he said something that made the crew at that Hawaii beach cry when they watched it on television. I want to dedicate this award to everyone who does the hard work that nobody sees. The people who make the magic happen while we get the glory. You know who you are, and I know who you are. Thank you. Bobby Kahale was watching from his living room in Honolulu, his daughter on his lap, Leilani beside him. When Frank said those words, Bobby knew Frank was talking to him, to the crew, to everyone who'd been there that day on the beach. The comeback was complete. Frank Sinatra had risen from the ashes, but he'd done it the right way, with his integrity intact, with his character proven. The story of From Here to Eternity is usually told as Frank Sinatra's comeback, the role that saved his career, the performance that proved he was more than just a singer, the Oscar that validated him. All of that is true, but there's another story buried in that film, one that didn't make the press kits or the promotional materials or the Oscar highlight reels. The story of what happened when a desperate man with nothing left to lose decided that some things matter more than survival, more than success, more than redemption. Frank Sinatra stopped a production on August 14, 1953. He risked the only chance he had left. He stared down a studio executive and refused to back down. He put his entire comeback, everything he'd fought for, on the line, and he did it for a stranger, a stunt extra named Bobby Kahale who hit his head on a rock and whose life would have been destroyed by medical bills if Frank hadn't said no. That's not just courage. That's character. That's knowing who you are when everything is stripped away, when you have nothing but your principles. Frank went on to become one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history. But on that beach in Hawaii, when everything was on the line, he proved he was something more important than a star. He was a man who knew the difference between right and wrong, and who chose right even when it cost him everything.